Can I just ask someone, can you see what I'm sharing?
Yes, it looks great.
Excellent. Let me figure out how to stop that. Okay, maybe I've stopped sharing now. How the hell did I do that?
Actually, we still see it.
Okay, sorry, I'll figure it out in a second.
No, don't worry.
Stop video. No, that's the wrong one.
I mean, in the worst case, I mean, I can automatically do it for you.
Okay, did you just do it for me? Because I don't think I did
Yes.
anything.
Yes,
Okay,
no,
perfect.
I clicked. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you, Eduardo. I'm just testing, right?
No
But,
worries. Yeah,
it seems fine.
Yes, hello, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Loud and clear.
Yes, hello. I'm trying to share my presentation. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
All right, good. Thanks. Is Panayotis around or?
I mean, you should be arriving anytime now. I'll send them a message real quick.
Okay, good morning. Good morning, all.
Good morning, Panagiotis.
Good morning.
Morning.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself, but Eduardo, I think, fixed that. Yeah, good morning, Alban, Stefan, and Francis. I have not seen you. Nice to meet you. Good. So, Alban, will you present the slides yourself finally?
Yeah, finally I found a way to share my screen, so that's fine. If
Okay.
you are here as backup, that's fine also. I don't know, but it should be fine. Fine.
Excellent, excellent. That's really excellent. So, yeah, I do not want to say much, but let's say we have the timing is for 15 to 17 minutes. So 1 or 2 minutes before you reach that, I will try to raise my hand and cut it short. Of course, I will not be, if you are close to the end, I will not interrupt you as much as possible. And then we have a Q&A following after each presentation, okay? So especially for you, Alban and Stefan, that you will not be in the final Q&A, I will say that clearly in order for everyone to send your the questions directly after you finish. Yeah, so you can the participants can either use the chat or they can even raise their hands. We'll see how this will go, and then probably going to select 1 or 2 most prominent questions for you in order not to explode the whole session from the beginning, and try to stick a bit to the time, though we have 2.5 hours, which I think is quite sufficient. But yeah, have I forgotten anything, Eduardo? Technical?
I mean, nothing on my side.
Just one question. So we start
Sure.
with Alban, then Stefan, and then myself, or how's the order?
Let me check again. It's Alban, Stefan, yeah, and then it's you, about you, Francis, and finally Paul Dean. I think we are all here except for Paul. Hope he joins soon.
Shall we have a very quick round of introduction among ourselves?
The idea is that, yeah, I'm gonna say a few words about you, just sort of bio before its presentation. So this is the
Yeah,
at least
just here.
Sorry.
Just here now.
Ah,
Nice to
yeah,
meet
yeah,
you.
for
Hi, I'm
for
Alban.
sure, yeah. Yeah, please, Alban, go on.
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Plenary. So I'm Alban from DG Climate Action in the European Commission. So I'm part of the economic analysis and modeling team or units within Clima. So happy to meet you all.
Thanks a lot, Alban. Also very nice to have somebody really working closely to the policy side here. It's great. Then Stefan, let's go to the turn that we have.
Sure, yeah, I'm Stefan Plenary. I'm an assistant professor for energy systems modeling at TU Delft.
Nice to meet you.
And Paul, you?
Maybe, yeah, I just followed. So Paul Joey, I'm full professor at the Europa Universität Flensburg and Economics of Energy System Transition.
Sorry, brief question for you, Paul. Will you present mostly about the EU or non-EU fossil
I
exit?
focus on EU now.
Ah, excellent. In this presentation, you mean focus on EU. Go, good.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Unless you want me to talk about something else, then I can.
No. I was just thinking about how to present it, because then it's Francis, I think, who will also say a few words about non-EU, right, Francis?
Yeah,
nice
exactly.
to meet you also.
So I'm Francis. Nice to meet you guys. I'm at the World Bank, also in the energy modeling group, no, in the economic modeling group, and I'm kind of the person focused on energy and climate over there.
Excellent. And okay, and finally it's Paul. He's just emailed me that he will not join. He will join in 5 minutes. Okay, hopefully he will manage to. I think that's it. So Eduardo, shall we begin or we wait a few 1 or 2 minutes more?
I don't know. I mean, I think the skill workshops have just ended, so maybe people are slowly coming in. Your
Okay,
choice.
so we wait 1 or 2 minutes. Let me also put the introductory slides. Just one slide, nothing fancy. Thanks also, Eduardo, for preparing that. Okay, so I think we can start now. It's not full screen, correct. I think, Eduardo, now I think we can start. So I want to welcome all of you in the second plenary session of the European Climate and Energy Modeling Platform. Good morning. My name is Panagiotis Fragos, and I work in E3 Modeling. I'm as a senior modeler, energy system and macroeconomic modeler. So the topic of the today's plenary is related to the transition towards net zero emissions. And also the required technical and societal changes that this may bring to the European countries, but also globally. Yesterday, there was a very nice discussion about the recent energy crisis and the role of energy security and geopolitics. And there, speakers actually agree that energy security is an important co-benefit of the low carbon transition in the EU. So this is a link with a previous session where actually the acceleration of the transition towards net zero that we discussed today is related to elimination of the negative impacts of the very high fossil fuel prices that we face now. So it's regarded as an important co-benefit of the transition. And of course, as we all know here, it's the transition to neutrality would be really challenging because it's a complex process and requires, let's say, transformational changes in all the sectors of the energy system and the economy. And there are two key aspects that is the focus today. The one is related to the innovation and the technical innovation that is required, especially for clean energy technologies that have not yet reached commercial maturity. And the second is about on the societal side, because there also profound changes should happen with behavioral changes, economic restructuring, and also lifestyle changes. So this is the topic of the today's session, and luckily to address all these topics, we have an excellent set of speakers, both from the research and the policy community, who will bring their interesting insights into this plenary. And before we start this, some brief technical details. So there are 5 speakers overall, and each of them has about 17 minutes to present. Then after each presentation, we'll have a Q&A that follows, where all participants can raise questions either in the chat or even by raising their hands. And then when the 5 presentations end, we have some remaining time, about 15 minutes, for an overall Q&A and summarizing this plenary session. So at any time, this is a request to the participants here, please pose the question to the chat and we will bring them to the presenters. So starting, the first speaker that we have today with us is Alban Ketous, who's a policy officer in the Economic Analysis and Modeling Unit of DG Klima of the European Commission. He has a lot of experience working in climate policy and energy system modeling, both as a modeler, but also as a user of such tools in the context of policymaking. So he tackles both aspects, I mean, both the policy side and also the research side. He has a professional experience in public research, the private sector, JRC, and also the European Commission. And his presentation focuses on the climate policy context and raising questions on model-based analysis, and how this model-based analysis can better articulate technology and behavioral aspects towards meeting the European climate neutrality objectives. So Alban, it's a pleasure, and the floor is yours to present. I stop sharing and you can start sharing your screen.
Thanks, Panayotis. Hi, good morning, everyone. Just give me a minute to present, yes, my presentation online. I hope this is visible for everyone. Yes, thanks, Panayotis. So good morning to all. Indeed, I'm speaking here from the European Commission, DG Climate Action. I'm part indeed of the economic analysis team. So we have a very strong interest in your discussions and in the work which is being carried out in the different horizon projects that are structuring this conference. Before starting on content, I'd like to thank the organizers first for organizing the conference. It's always for us kind of milestone event when it comes to research findings and research progress. We always follow and try to participate with great interest. And we'd like to thank also the organizers for inviting us. Yesterday, my head of unit, I think, did a few introductory words for the first day and for the conference in general. And today, this is our contribution to Day 2, which is also a very important day. Many interesting questions for us on the policy making side. So my presentation today will focus on questions we have on what could be the roles for innovation, societal and technical change. These are very important questions for to design and think about future policy making to get to climate neutrality. Of course, the policy framework question is here to put in place conditions for change to take place. And to bring our EU economy to climate neutrality by 2050. And the better we understand, drivers and dynamics that relates both to technology, options, but also to societal development, societal questions. I think the better, our position is in terms of thinking and defining future policy frameworks. So from that perspective, it's very, I think, useful, day of discussions, and we hope that that eventually, that will help you to pursue research questions and maybe provide answers and support us eventually.
Alban, sorry.
Okay.
Sorry, Alban, sorry to interrupt before you really take a deep dive into. We see that there's a gray window that blocks the right side of your slides. If there's any way to remove that, do you also see it yourself, or it's something?
That might be the chat window of Zoom, or even the kind of participants thing. This has happened to me before.
Yeah, I'm trying to remove. Do you see this?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Let me. Is it better like this?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, now it's much smaller, at least.
Yeah. Okay, sorry about that.
No,
All right.
okay. Now I think it's fine. Yeah, you can continue.
Okay,
sorry,
great.
sorry for interrupting.
Yes. Okay, thanks. So in this presentation, I will say a word on our context, and then how we see, the role. I mean, the questions related to the role of these different drivers and important dimensions of for the transition to climate neutrality. So the first element is just a small reminder among ourselves on the key importance of climate policies. Okay, we all know that right now we are going through a very severe energy crisis, which seems to to be discussed as possibly competing or conflicting with our climate goals. So I just put here a couple of headline titles that you can see here and there in the press or in the research community. I'm glad to hear that your conclusion of yesterday's discussion was, the energy security dimension is a clear co-benefit of climate policies, and thus that both dimensions actually go in the same direction. Yes, I'm trying to. Yes. Okay. So, but nonetheless, indeed, we are facing now with this kind of short-term energy crisis. Short-term, we hope, of course. But the climate change is still unfolding, and you can see here a few just illustrative, elements on the climate crisis that not only the EU economy but our human society is about to face, with this fairly dramatic statement by the UN Secretary General a few weeks ago. That accompanied the publication of this United in Science 2022 report, which is a kind of a summary of the latest development on the climate here on the climate front. Also interesting articles recently published on the climate tipping points being about to be triggered. So as a clear reminder that we should keep these elements in mind and keep working towards climate neutrality and mitigating climate change. Okay, so where do we stand in the EU? So first of all, there's the EU adopted about 15 months ago the so-called European Climate Law Regulation, which defines a number of very important climate objectives for the EU economy as a whole. It sets as legally binding this climate neutrality objective by 2050. This is Article 2 of that regulation. And it also updates the 2030 targets to at least 55% net GHG reductions compared to 1990, as a significant step up compared to the previously existing climate target for 2030, which was 40%. The climate law also calls regulation to propose an intermediate climate targets for 2040. So this is something we are working on, and that should come somewhere in 2024. Okay. So where are we today? So on this graphic, you see the evolution of the EU 27 net GHG emissions since 1990. We can see that there's been some progress since the mid 2000s, and this is where we need to go. So even though we can all be happy of the progress made so far, there's still quite some way to go. And this, so there you can see the 55% objective in 2030, and then the climate neutrality in 2050. So the question then is how to get there. And behind this curve, you have very different dynamics, structural responses, logics, and things happening across sectors and within sectors. And our main question on the articulation between technology and societal change will be, I guess, assessed and addressed very differently across sectors. So this is where we see, value of the research you're making now and in the future to help us identify how it will play out in the different sectors. So behind this overall net GHG emission curve, you have, as I said, different sectors with very different kind of economic contexts and drivers and values, say, for society. And they all undergo contrasted sectoral dynamics. So in this graphic, you see the evolution of net GHG emissions or GHG emissions per sector since 2005 for the main sectors. What do we see? We see that some sectors actually show a fairly stable pattern with some decrease in the mid-2010s and then increase again recently, which would be agriculture and transport. Some sectors have undergone reductions around 2010 and then have stabilized since. Other sectors, that's industry. Other sectors go through fairly, steady decline over time. This is the case of waste, for instance. And other sectors actually go through an accelerated decline of their GHG emissions over the last years. That's, for instance, the case of power and heat. So behind that graphic, you have very different dynamics. You have very different drivers. They sometimes interact across sectors, of course. There are also different potentials and options, and that was true historically. It will be even more true in the future. And thus, it calls for potentially different ways to explore that question on technology versus behavior. To which extent do they compete? To which extent do they complement each other? What's the best mix in terms of changes to be expected and or necessary? So how to get to climate neutrality? So by 2030, there's now a policy framework in so-called co-decision. We hope to get something stable and adopted in somewhere in 2023, and it proposes a combination of sectoral regulatory instruments and of carbon pricing instruments to spur uptake of GHG reduction options in the different in a range of sectors. So what's for the post 2030 situation beyond the reach of the Fit for 55 policy framework? So our questions are which pathway for each of the different sectors, and within each sector, what would be the relative contribution of technology versus behavior? Yes. So in terms of future dynamics, what are our questions here? The one question for the energy sector in particular is the articulation between supply and demand. Can we decarbonize fully our energy system through supply related options only? To which extent demand should contribute, or reduction of demand across the different sectors? Which future supply to deliver energy services and security of supply? I just put here some some illustrative reports on would renewable energy, which is perceived by all as a key contributor to our future supply, can it face some difficulties for its development? There's now a lot of discussion around the hydrogen, as a key option. We've had that discussion 20 years ago. So how to make sure that this time around we actually, go to concrete action and concrete development. Is technology enough? I'm just put here as an illustrative, picture, a potential role for instance, city, urban environments. To the extent, for instance, mobility patterns within this environment will rely on technology only and/or on behavior or a combination of both. What impacts should we expect across the board, across sectors, for different social groups? How much will it cost for whom? What can it bring also as a transition in terms of opportunities and benefits? And of course, there's a very horizontal and important question on how to ensure a socially just transition. That's of course a prerequisite for the transition to happen and be politically acceptable. Okay, so to conclude on my presentation, and also to open the door for discussions now or later in the different maybe parallel sessions or later in your projects. What could be the next steps for energy and climate modeling as a support to policy making? Well, there's the obvious question on whether and how to increase the descriptive capacity of the analytical tools, maybe how to present asymmetric impact on social groups or on regions. That's one avenue, but I guess there are also others. Maybe wider or more all-encompassing question would be on the perspective of the analysis. Should we envisage to articulate these questions around wider, what I call here, key societal functions? So beyond the traditional sectoral view, which basically follows, energy balance description. Should we think on the terms of food supply, but for instance, or mobility, but taking into account both the direct and the indirect, for instance, energy needs to deliver these societal functions or societal services. And then, as the big question for us is, beyond models, a model will always provide a solution, or in most cases. So the question for us then is how to convert, modeling-based analysis and insight into real-life developments, and through, for instance, a policy framework, but it could also be it could go beyond the policy framework question. So on this, I would like to thank you again. I wish you a fruitful conference across the day, and I'm happy to take questions now on, if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you, Alban, for these very interesting insights that you shared with us. Actually, we do have a question by Francesco Cardumi from KTH. I think it's one of the quite important question, because in the slide 5, where you show the evolution of greenhouse gas emissions in the EU, you showed that there was quite a drop in the emissions following the crisis of 2009-2010, which, however, was not recovered afterwards. This is not what we see now, for instance, because you saw that in 2021 emissions already increased. So what happened then? Were there some structural reductions, or are there any learnings that we can learn from that, and what we did well probably the previous time?
Yes, so it's a good question. I think many things happened during the, since the mid-2000s. We faced the financial crisis of around 2008 and 2009. There's also, the implementation of policy instruments, both on the climate front, the ETS, the effort sharing regulation, with explicit and specific targets for sectors, for the countries. Plus, I think it was a time when the 2020 energy and climate package was agreed, which was followed by the first 2030 energy and climate package. So I would say that what drove these emissions and avoided that bounce back to previous levels was largely the concrete deployment of a relevant policy framework. There may have been some effects, maybe in some sectors, for instance, in some industrial sectors, which should be maybe assessed more in detail, which did not recover and or did adapt, to the new market situation since, and then maintained a decrease of emissions over time. So I guess it's a range of explanations. The current situation is very different because the COVID affected to a large extent the transport sector and mobility patterns, which we could expect to recover. Okay. There are many drivers and elements to consider, but I would say that the EU climate policy framework also played a very important role in steering the our overall GHG emissions down.
Yes, thanks a lot. I mean, quite clear explanation. And meanwhile, we also have a second question from Bernard Goni, and to you, Alban. What exactly do you mean by key societal functions, and how would this concept be useful?
Yes. So the idea is, so far, I think most of the analysis of the energy sector and also for GHG emissions is focusing on individual sectors without an integration on the so-called societal services level. I just take as an example food. So the food supply adds up a number of steps starting from the food production to the food transport, the food processing, the food cooking. So, and along that chain, you have a lot of direct emissions, especially when food is produced. You also have direct emissions to transport food, to process food in industry, to deliver food in services, and then to cook food. You also have indirect emissions and energy needs to produce the transportation means to carry around the food, and so on and so forth. So an idea would be to add on top of the current description of the energy system a reading of how it will evolve from that societal function perspective. Of course, there will be a need, some research needs to conduct a decomposition of energy consumption and related emissions across these different societal functions. We think it would be an interesting also perspective to analyze results, to analyze future pathways, to analyze what would a climate neutral EU economy would look like from this perspective.
Thank you, Alban. I absolutely agree on that. I mean, it is very, very important to see a holistic picture of things, how, for instance, the socioeconomic restructuring, how this interplays with the transition. So yeah, I think it's very interesting. And any more questions? Or if nobody has, I have one last for you, Alban, as we have you there, and of course you have all the picture from the Commission. And you mentioned this, let's say, technology versus behavior measures. And I want to ask you, in the current framework of the energy crisis that we face, and for instance, the large elimination of Russian imported gas, how you see these two aspects playing a role? Will the EU try to focus more on one or the other, and what are the interlinkages there? Or you see both of them playing a role?
It's a good question. I think it's a really it's a good it's a very clear applied case of how to play on these on these two dimensions at the same time. The crisis we're facing is very short term. It's an immediate crisis. So the technological response will be pushed to its maximum, but we expect its potential to be limited. It will span alternative supply, but again the potential is limited to accelerated deployment of alternatives to natural gas for this winter and for the next winter. On that respect, I mean the Commission has proposed a number of actions to succeed. But I think there's also an understanding that that behaviors will play a role to close the gap. And on that one, we see on the stage, communicating to citizens that heating needs will need to be maybe adapted so as to ensure a smooth winter for all. There's so it's a combination of incentivizing people to adapt their behavior and trying to at the same time push for the technology solution to the extent possible in a very rapid manner and to the extent possible.
Good. Thank you a lot for all these very interesting insights. Unfortunately, I have to say that Alban will not stay with us for the last Q&A session, but of course we appreciate the time that and the effort you devoted in all this. And yeah, thanks a lot, Alban. And now, if there are not any other questions, probably we should move to our next speaker, who is Professor Stefan Pfenniger, an assistant professor in energy systems modeling at TU Delft. And his current research focusing on understanding the spatio-temporal variability of renewable generation, and also quantifying the technical and political trade-offs between the different possible ways towards reaching a net zero energy system. So Stefan here will present the results from the Sentinel project using the high-resolution pan-European energy system model Euro-Calliope. And also he will also discuss additional socio-political aspects from this project as well. So yeah, Stefan, the floor is yours, and of course you can share your screen.
Thanks a lot, Panagiotis. Do you see any gray boxes, or is everything clear?
No, it's everything clear.
Okay, good, super. Okay, so I'm going to talk, well, exactly about the thing that the title promises, the diversity of options to decarbonize the European energy system in a world where we want to go almost entirely renewable and where we want Europe to completely stop importing fossil fuels. Now, Bryn Pickering is actually the main author of the study that I'm presenting, and the reason I'm here and not him is that he's currently traveling on an extended vacation. This is him in the Karakol Valley in Kyrgyzstan. Now, seeing a photo like this and being a mountain person myself, I kind of wish that Bryn was here at the conference and I was there traveling instead, but we all have our lot in life, and my lot is to present these results, educate and entertain you for the next 15 minutes or so. So let's get going. What is the background to this study? Well, in the decades between 2010 and 20 or so, a lot of detailed modeling went into the question of whether the variable renewables, primarily wind and solar power, could serve as the foundation for clean energy system despite their variability. And this body of work built up a clear evidence base that this indeed is possible. But of course, a lot of open questions still remain. And we want to focus on three aspects in particular. First, the carbon neutral whole European energy system covering all sources of energy demand, including industrial feedstocks from fossil sources, which opens up challenges like increased electricity demand, but also opportunities like flexibility from sector coupling. Second, we wanted to know whether this can be done without import of fuels or electricity. And third, and most important, we wanted to know what is actually the option space in terms of technology choice and spatial deployment of infrastructure to reach this goal? What kind of decisions can a policymaker take, and what are the trade-offs between these decisions? Just briefly, since we're at a conference about modeling, this is the high-level overview of the model that we use here, which was developed by Bryn Pickering. So what we do is we cover all demand for all energy in all sectors across Europe, including industrial feedstocks. We consider the regional distribution of demand here. You see the example building heat. Third, we have the time varying supply and demand as hourly time series here, just as a stylized picture. The very important fact that, for example, solar power supply is anti-correlated with building heat demand. And finally, we have all the technologies for energy supply conversion, transport, and their possible locations across the continent. And with this model, what we found is that we can supply all of Europe with renewables, no imported fuels needed. So comparing the gross available energy for the 34 European countries that we model here with 2018 Eurostat data and our solutions, we see first that less energy will be needed. Why? Because the efficiency gains from electrification. So we designed a range of different possible systems, and we'll get back to that range and these different possible systems in a moment. But you can see that some of them require less energy than others, but always less energy than today. And these differences between the different solutions that we've come up with is mainly due to differences in degree of electrification. So for example, electrification of transport is more energy efficient than hydrogen. So you can see that we go from relying primarily on fossil fuels to relying primarily on renewables. And some other things remain. There are some assumptions in the model, for example, related to nuclear. We simply assume that countries do what they've announced that they want to do. So some countries will phase out nuclear, others will build some additional nuclear capacity. But other than that, nuclear generation capacity is fixed in the model because we really want to focus in on the possible role of renewables. Now, on top of this modeling machine, we add the SPORES algorithm, which was developed by Francesco Lombardi. And that's an algorithm that uses our model setup not just to look for a single cost optimal solution, but rather starts searching around that optimal solution to look for other options where the configuration of the system looks radically different in terms of what kinds of technologies are used and where in Europe they're deployed. All the while staying within a certain distance, say 10%, from the minimal cost found in the original cost optimal solution. Now, what we're interested in is understanding to what extent these different possible solutions serve the preferences of different people, citizens, planners, decision makers, and so on. So let's say I want to minimize the use of bioenergy because I'm concerned about its land use. That selects some of the options and it excludes other options. When I then add other preferences, like I might want to limit the use of large amounts of energy storage because I'm concerned about resource use or commercial availability of some storage technologies. That again limits me to just some of the possible options. And we can explore this decision space to look for options that fulfill several preferences at once to try to start homing in on consensus solutions. So the second finding here is that many options are technically possible, but these preferences restrict the spatial and technical maneuvering space we actually have. So this is the high-level overview of what we did. Let's actually look at some of the results. To understand the decision space, we can pick some metrics that might be relevant for decisions, like the example I already used of storage capacity needed continent-wide. And we can score each of our solutions for this metric, 0 being the solution with the least storage and 1 with the most storage needed, and look where all of the other solutions fall in this range. In this study, we generated 441 solutions. So here you see 441 dots, and each dot is one of our solutions and represents a complete and detailed picture of the entire European energy system. Now, we can do this for a whole range of metrics. That's what you see here. And this allows us to start looking at trade-offs between different choices. Again, I might say I want to look for solutions that do not rely too much on energy storage. So I want to sort of focus in on these solutions here with relatively low storage requirements. And I can pick one solution here marked by this orange cross. Let's call that the low use of storage solutions. And I want to see how well this solution does on all the other metrics. Now, we said previously, I might also be worried about the use of biofuels. I might be worried about ecosystem impacts, about land use implications, whatever it is. I would like to have a solution that doesn't require all of Europe's biofuel potential. So I want to look for another solution that minimizes the use of biofuels, and I can find that solution. And it turns out there's one that also actually requires less storage than the first solution I found. So let's call this the low use of biofuel solution, highlighted here in purple. But this solution, on the other hand, requires a very high degree of heat electrification, close to 100%. That makes sense. Biofuels falling away as a potential source of heat is being replaced instead by heat from electricity, heat pumps. So there's another trade-off here to be made. And we can use this approach to look at all of these options which are considered equally technically feasible by our model, and use the factors that a model like ours cannot handle, like whether or not you want to rely on bioenergy, to look for desirable solutions. Now, because underlying this is a model with high spatial and temporal detail, we can also look at what this implies for infrastructure deployment. For example, we can look at the transmission grid, comparing the low biofuel and the low storage cases. Here we see the total grid expansion indicated by the thickness of the blue lines. You can see that there's a similar magnitude of grid expansion, but where exactly the model wants to reinforce the grid is quite different. But I can also search through the solutions and find others that require much less or even no grid expansion at all. So here's an example with half as much grid expansion. So we thought it also makes sense to make it easier to allow ourselves, as well as anybody, including all of you, to explore these options using the metrics that I just used here. And for that, we built an interactive web application. On the left of this application, you have the metrics, and you can narrow down the range of these metrics to filter the options. Then you click on an option in the scatter plot on the bottom left, and it shows you the spatial detail of where infrastructure would be placed in this specific option. So the key point again here is that while the diversity of options is very large, the more you impose specific preferences, like having as little bioenergy as possible, the more your maneuvering space is reduced. Now, this is all good and well, but one problem is that we as researchers decided on the question and we decided on the metrics to use. So I'm sitting here in my office thinking, well, maybe people are worried about bioenergy, so that's one of the levers we should give people to filter our results with. And this remains very much what's been called the loading dock approach to managing the science policy interface. It's basically us showing up as researchers, as scientists, with a truck full of scientific results and dropping them off at the loading dock, hoping this will somehow help people, the people we call stakeholders, to make better decisions. But what if our selection of metrics is all wrong, for example? So a better approach would be co-production. That way, the people that need to use these results in their decision-making are involved from the start as the modeling happens in a highly interactive way with back and forth between research and practice. You see an example here from the US National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, which involved diverse stakeholders in planning Hawaii's energy future in ways that let these stakeholders interact directly with and influence directly the models. It was a very, very successful approach that NREL is now replicating elsewhere in the US as well as internationally. So I think this kind of work is really important. And also Alban pointed this out in the conclusions of his talk, this linking of model-based analysis to real-world developments. And building further on the work from the Sentinel project, we're now working on a system where people can play with the model results in a way that lets them tell the model what their preferences are. This is then fed back into the model, which can generate more relevant options for the kinds of trade-offs that the user is actually interested in. And we call that the human-computer loop. Now, it's being developed in the SEEDS project, which is going to be ready at some point next year. So stay tuned for those results. To conclude now, I just want to highlight that this sector-coupled Euroclipey model, which was developed in the Sentinel project, it's also being used elsewhere within the project. One thing we've done in Sentinel is to link together different models that each have their individual strengths to answer new questions. I won't go into details, but this figure gives you an idea of how this is a rather involved process with lots of arrows going in different directions across these different model boxes. What I want to highlight here is just one very specific subset of this, where our European energy system model delivers its results to the VECDIN general equilibrium model to assess macroeconomic effects. And the first result is that it seems that energy systems which are costlier than alternatives from just looking at a pure total energy infrastructure cost perspective can have positive employment effects through indirect economy-wide channels. So a total system cost that's higher in the energy system model might not be all bad. This approach allows us to answer policy relevant questions that an individual model could not have answered alone. And if you're interested to hear more about that, I also highly recommend Jakob Meyer's talk this afternoon in parallel session 6, who will talk about this activity in more detail. For now, that's it from my side. I should also mention that all of this work in all the underlying model and data are freely available under open licenses. Calliope, the underlying open source software that we develop, is also freely and openly available. And we're very interested in feedback and always open for collaboration. So thanks a lot for your attention. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Stefan, for these very, very interesting insights. Quite, important modeling developments, and especially how you try to also deal with the socio-political, let's say, feasibility in a sense of all this, decarbonization pathways. So, any question? Because until now, I think I have not seen anything in the chat, but anyone wanting to ask Stefan something? Okay, probably not. Let me also, say, a question is that, you described the process as more of presenting the stakeholders what we have in terms of different trade-offs between the different decarbonization pathways, etc. So how you actually see this co-production process to feed into your very detailed modeling? Do you have any indications of, for instance, stakeholder preference or ways to attract, to gather the stakeholder preferences and then feeding them into the model? Or, for instance, how you see societal restrictions, like, for instance, if in some countries there is now strong opposition to new wind onshore farms, etc. So are all of this taken into account in a sense in the model, and how these aspects can be improved?
Sure, I think so. So some of these aspects are quite easy to quantify, like the resistance to say onshore wind development. You can simply lower your resource potential in the model to represent that, and other things are much harder. But what I think is important is to make sure that the model, it matches the scale of decision making, and that you then talk to people at the right scale with the right model. So the example I just showed at the very end from the SEEDS project, that's a case study in Portugal, where our Portuguese partner really knows who the right people are to invite to these events, and the model then is also focused on delivering enough detail on Portugal so that the kind of information you get out of the model is actually relevant for the scale of decisions that these people are working with. Otherwise, the whole thing falls apart from the start.
Exactly, yeah. This to be realistic and be ground truth, for instance, it's always important when you go into very specific national or sub-national context. And I want to repeat again that Stefan will not be with us for the final Q&A. So anyone that has any question, please raise it now. And in the meantime, we have one from Koen van Grevenbroek, if I say it correctly, sorry. A more technical question. He says that there seem to be bands or clusters of model solutions in some of the metrics that you presented. Is this an artifact of the modeling approach, or how you can explain that?
Yeah, so yeah, it is. There are some, I mean, in some cases you're at the very low end of the scale that's technically feasible. So a lot of solutions cluster around that. And then sometimes we also, to explore the role of a specific technology, we ask the algorithm to generate more solutions going in one direction. So then we might have a sort of band in one dimension that's varying in another dimension. But the algorithm is still under further development. So also expect more on that. And if you want to talk about algorithmic details, nitty-gritty details, then get in touch with Francesco Lombardi, who I think is also in this session, and we'll be very happy to talk about the details.
Oh, okay. So I do not know, Eduardo, is there any way to allow Francesco Lombardi say a few words on this, more technical details? Now I see that Francesco is a co-host, so bro, you can speak up if you want, Francesco. Okay.
Hello, can you hear me? Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I was okay. I was also trying to switch on my camera, but I wasn't allowed before. So yeah, no, I think Stefan, what Stefan said is perfectly correct. So the reason why you have some bands is because we explicitly try to force sometimes the algorithm in some corners of the decision space in which the let's say technological options are kind of fixed to a certain extent, but we vary the way in which technologies are deployed from a spatial perspective. So when you see things that seem to be similar from a technological standpoint, so many solutions which have the same amount of wind onshore, for instance, that doesn't mean that they are redundant solutions, because actually they have different ways of deploying these technologies at the subnational scale. And that is precisely one of the key things that stakeholders care about in the real world. So right now we have a preprint out called "What is redundant and what is not: computational trade-offs in methods for generating alternatives," which deals precisely with this kind of apparent issue, which is actually not an issue, but it's something that we do on purpose. So if you want more information about that, you can reach out to me, of course, but also have a look at the preprint that is out.
Thanks a lot, Francesco. And also you can post the preprint in the chat for everyone interested to take a look. Good. And also now have another question from Bernard Goniros about your personal opinion, Stefan, on what are the main technological and non-technological challenges to achieve a clean energy backbone.
Well, that's a good question, and also a very large question. Maybe I'll focus on the technological challenges because those are the ones I probably know more about. I think one of the key questions is still the longer term variability, dealing with that, which comes especially to the fore the closer you get to 100% or close to 100% renewables. How exactly will this work? Which of the many possible options will ultimately turn out to be the one that works best in practice? I think there's still uncertainty there. There's actually a very interesting paper out just a few days ago or 2 weeks ago or something in Joule about exactly this question, different strategies to get the last 10% of renewables when almost the whole grid is already renewable and you start removing these last sources of non-renewable flexibility. So this, but there's lots of options on the table there, and it'll be interesting to see which ones turn out to be most viable.
Thanks, Stefan. Probably the last question for you is from Will Asser, the coordinator of the ECMF project. And Will asks that you hinted that technology choices open and close other options. So there are certain trade-offs probably. Does this reinforce the point that policymakers need to move away from technology neutrality? This was also a discussion that we had in the plenary yesterday about technology neutrality or not. So Stefan.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I'd say that policymakers need to move away from technology neutrality, but also when you build the system, you have to move away from technology neutrality because you're going to have to make some choices sooner or later about which technologies to actually build and which to actually use. So yeah, I think choices are needed, and one choice in one direction closes off some of the other choices, and it's important to keep this in mind early on when planning the next step.
Yeah, also this question is quite challenging to reply because there are pros and cons in both approaches. So yeah, having said that, I have to thank you, Stefan, a lot for giving this great presentation. And good luck with everything you do after ECMP. And now we move to the third speaker, who is Professor Pao Yu Hoei. He's a full professor of economics of sustainable energy system transition at the Europa Universitat of Flensburg, and is the head of the research group Fossil Exit. So he coordinates the independent research hub Coal Transitions, which has a presence in all 5 continents and involving more than 60 researchers. The topic of his presentation today is about modeling just fossil exit pathways. And of course, the focus is on how to ensure that fossil fuels gets replaced in the context of just transition. So, Pao Yu, the room is yours.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I hope that you don't see any black or gray pieces basically in my picture. Otherwise,
no.
please let me know.
It's fine. It's fine.
And therefore, thank you very much for being here. Thanks for the organizers for organizing this European conference. I think it's fully understandable that it can only be online, but nevertheless, it is of course a shame. And I've basically divided my talk also into two different parts. One being a bit more on modeling, and the second part a bit more provocative, as I think that these conferences are here to, on one hand, exchange our point of views as energy modelers and how we can make models better. But at the same time, I think it's also important sometimes to question the work that we do. And therefore, as this is kind of like it's not totally internal, but nevertheless, I think it is kind of like a close community in some kind of way, as we've known one another for a long time. I think it's good to also be honest about the shortcomings of models sometimes. And just as a context, because some people might still know me more affiliated to the Technical University Berlin. I switched to Flensburg University, but I'm still involved in the projects, and some of the work that I'm presenting is based a bit on some research that scholars did in the Open Entrance project, as well as in the Sintran project. The Open Entrance is a modeling project. The Sintran project looks more on carbon-intensive regions and transitions, where people such as Panagiotis also do modeling, but we, for example, more look at social aspects. And so therefore, I try to bridge a bit like qualitative and quantitative aspects, and how far at some point in time, at least in our team, not yet today, but maybe in the future years, we can try to build even better, I wouldn't necessarily always say models, but basically better predictions or so comes about how the future will evolve. So therefore, this is some of the things that I will be talking about. Some of the model results that I will show at the beginning are based on the Model Genesis mod that was developed by several colleagues of mine, Konstantin Döffler and Carlo Heinz, also giving presentations on this during today, actually, one is in parallel even, about different topics of how to decarbonize the European electricity sector. It's an energy system model, in this case, in this setting, so to speak, examining more or less country-wise representation until 2050, and we have the electricity, buildings, industry, and transportation sector, and we basically look at how far it is possible to stay within pathways that are in line with 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrade, and we do this in part of the Open Entrance project, which several people are presenting various parts of our studies within these slides, etc. Just jumping a bit to some of the results, and I just want to highlight some things. And as my focus is a bit not only on the integration of renewable energy, but also on the question like how can we phase out fossil fuels? And fossil fuels indicated in this bar where we see the primary energy supply. So therefore not only the electricity sector, but all sectors accumulated. And due to the higher efficiency of the primary energy usage of renewables, the overall energy needed, so to speak, is being reduced over time. And we can see that especially the darker colors, so in brown is coal, in black it's oil, and then we have gas in this one of the red colors, so to speak, the lighter red, so to speak, and we can see that especially their consumption goes down. In this case, these are 4 different scenarios that we have developed, out of which they always have some preference. We have a techno-friendly, a societal commitment, which is basically kind of relatively clear. We have a gradual development in a directed transition with more policy intervention within there. And we can see that even though, of course, the phase out year of different energy carriers is different across time, it is a relatively simple picture, so to speak, that coal across Europe needs to be phased out more or less by 2035 to be in line with these targets, oil more or less by 2040. And with respect to gas, it depends a bit on the assumptions. In our cases, we would see gas phase out within the 2040s. In this case, only depicting numbers until 2050 for different scenarios, showcasing the need to transition and showcasing that from a techno-economic optimization, it is possible, and depending on different preferences in different settings, availabilities of resources, etc., we see different aspects. Energy security is, of course, something that has been talked about a lot also yesterday, and which is very understandable due to the current political situation. And therefore, also one of the things I wanted to share here is, in this case, basically plotted the different countries across years, and you see the share of domestic electricity generation across a year, so to speak. So therefore, of course, there might be always times, hours where countries are net exporters or importers, but simplistically speaking, all the green dots are basically countries that for the entire year would become net exporter over time, which is especially true for the countries in Scandinavia. And you would see countries in the reddish colors being in particular also more landlocked countries, Czech Republic, for example, which would be more dependent on basically imports of electricity generation by the neighboring countries, which is of course valued differently with the political situation at hand now compared to how things were when we started these modeling exercises basically 2 years ago or something like this. So therefore, of course, things have changed, but it is important to see that depending on your preferences, I think Stefan's presentation also has shown this, you can shift a bit the demand production across the country if you kind of prioritize certain aspects, but from a techno-economic modeling perspective, you can relatively easily see that it has certain advantages, but nevertheless, decentralization can be of certain advantage. Another topic that is talked a lot about when we want to talk about phase out of fossil fuels is how do we replace it? And in some cases, in cases where we cannot use direct electrification, hydrogen becomes an option according to the model results. And in this case, we are showing the model results basically based on the hydrogen usages across the different scenarios, including the additional need for storage aspects of hydrogen, etc. You can see the electrolyzers being in the light blue colors, the far biggest need, so to speak, and you can see in the negative figures, so to speak, the different sectors where it would be used, which is especially in different sectors such as transportation, building, but for example, not so much the power sector. And I think this is also something that is visible across different models, that hydrogen is of importance. However, it is not a solution for all different sectors simply because it is too expensive. In our case, also, we assume that the hydrogen needs to be produced within the geographical boundaries of Europe, including Turkey in our model. So therefore, we are not basing our assumptions on cheap hydrogen, green hydrogen being imported, but it's green hydrogen being produced within the European Union. And therefore, this would imply a ramp up, which is considerate, and the question how far this is then feasible technologically. I was asked just when we started this call like 1 hour ago by Panagiotis whether I will only be talking about Europe, and it was like, yeah, actually only prepared for Europe. But as you can then mention that there was some global aspects, I just included an additional figure just by some other results that we did on, for example, a country such as Colombia, just to showcase a bit that, of course, we also have employment effects that we can calculate with our model, where you can see, for example, more or less simplistically speaking, in the light colors like yellow and blue, renewable jobs, you can see the brown reddish colors like in the fossil fuel industry. And you can see that depending on the different sectors, in this case, construction, fuel supply, manufacturing, and operation and maintenance, more and more jobs can exist across time. However, it doesn't have to be in the same region necessarily. It doesn't have to be the same paid job, doesn't have to be the same person. But nevertheless, even for countries such as Colombia, which are huge fossil fuel exporters, the renewable energy transition can entail a lot of jobs. And I think this is a positive message to bring out there, that this fossil fuel transition can include job aspects and can be just if implemented correctly. With an interim conclusion on some of the model results that I just showed is that many models, not just ours, but of many people, modeling teams present also here in this call today, showed that a full decarbonization is possible by 2050, even by 2045, if we kind of adjust the parameters. This implies the phase out of all fossil fuels by 2035 or in the 2040s, depending on the carrier, and that we will see a shifting of energy production centers, which will have an impact on trade patterns as well as matters of energy security as well as employment. We also see that the model comes up with a need, so to speak, for some cases, in our case, not that much negative emission technologies, but in our case as well, hydrogen and different technological solutions, so to speak, which might seem plausible. However, all of this comes with a kind of risk, because I just want to put this out there. Many of our models had different scenarios. However, we also have to be honest that actually none of our models or scenarios had expected the energy and CO2 prices, which we actually currently see in Europe. So in one way, we are always having different pathways to model all potential future reality, so to speak. But nevertheless, reality within the last year has proven us all wrong, that our assumptions, due to many different things that nobody could have assumed, were somehow wrong. So therefore, we just want to point out that we have to be a bit cautious when over-interpreting the importance of our results. And I think this also leads me to a bit the question, like, what can models do and what they cannot include in some cases. And of course, there are teams such as Stefan's team, which I think is on the right track to include more of these aspects. But to remember always that this energy transition does not happen in a techno-economic vacuum, but in the middle of the society. And we have to keep society within the boat, because we live in a democracy for a good reason. And therefore, we have to kind of increase the acceptance for the transition that we want to go for. And to put this even in a bit more drastic words, I would like to quote basically some other authors that pointed out in an article, which I found quite relatively interesting, that there's a certain risk to just trust too much in our models. I don't want to say that we don't need them, but quoting them, Such models represent society as a web of idealized, emotionless buyers and sellers, and thus ignore complex social and political realities, or even the impacts of climate change itself. The implicit promise is that market-based approaches will always work. And this is, I think, something for us to reflect about, that in one way, models are good and they can do certain things, but especially we modelers know the flaws of our own models, and we know that we cannot easily trust the numbers of other people's models unless we have really double-checked them. However, in reality, people that are not modelers sometimes also overinterpret the numbers and basically believe them to be true because it's a certain number that seems more credible than a political statement just by itself. So therefore, there is the need for these models. However, it has to be treated with certain caution, I would say. So therefore, I think this is important, especially within the modeling community, to have this in mind. And there's some work that was done by a PhD student of mine, Alexandra Krumm, together with two other researchers, combining a bit also different works. Diana Süßer is also part of the Sentinel project, so it's not only our work, but joined with others, where they try to examine a bit, so what is the current status quo of models, and in how far do they include already social aspects within their modeling approaches? And there's different ways of basically focusing on this. Simplistically speaking, you can either focus on storylines, scenarios, input parameters. I think this is what most people currently focused on. Then there would be the interaction with the simulation optimization process, or you would basically have a bit of more output discussion, interpretation of the results, putting it into context. And then of course the concepts, theories in general, and they differentiated between basically different ways of integration. You could either bridge, so a real exchange between the different groups of scientists, so to speak. You could have an iterative approach, where basically story and simulation approach, just back and forth until everyone is happy, so to speak. Or you could really try to merge aspects and structurally define the model in a more complex way, which I think is the most challenging way. And this is basically the way that they clustered the different things, and then they try to look into the literature and try to see, so where are we as a modeling community? They looked at the models that are included within the Open Entrance and Sentinel projects, so two big Horizon projects. And they looked, first of all, which of the models at all mention some kind of social aspects within the description, within the papers, within the publication. And you can see that out of the 28 models that are existing, only 13 models somehow at least mention social aspects. Could be that some of the other models have a perfect representation of all social aspects, but they just fail to mention it, which I think would also be some kind of fail in some kind of way. But therefore they had like a remaining set of 13 models that had some kind of inclusion of social aspects. And then they kind of tried to group which aspects of which social aspects are integrated within the different model types, and in how far this is including the storyline and the scenarios, or more the optimization process, or the discussion of model output. And what you can see here is that in general, simplistically speaking, this is just in how far this is included. This is not evaluating how far this is sufficiently included, or in how far this is done in a good or bad way, or how often it is included, but just more to just provide a first snapshot, so to speak. We can see that all model types kind of integrate behavior and lifestyle aspects already relatively well. At least they are aware of these, I would say. Some models are aware that public acceptance is an issue and that they try to deal with this in some kind of way. However, we, for example, see that transformation dynamics is not really included in hardly any of the model. And transformation dynamics means in this case that it is not so easy sometimes to phase out a fossil fuel within a short amount of time. Technically, it is possible to phase out coal in Poland maybe within 20 years. Politically, it is not possible, I would say, because simply there's certain powers. There's also, of course, certain technical challenges, but there's even more social and political aspects which make it much more difficult for certain regions to phase out an energy carrier. It is in some regions much more difficult to phase in an energy carrier if you don't have the infrastructure, if you don't have the mindset, if you don't have the lobby. And these are things that are just sometimes not sufficiently integrated in the models. And I think it's important to have this in mind. We also see that in general, there's a lot of focus on storyline, scenario, and input parameter, because I think this is a bit more easier. And there's less work until now, I think, on the optimization and simulation process, because this is sometimes really difficult to include this. Nevertheless, I think that there are some people trying to work on this, but I think it's important to have this even more in mind when we try to come up with models that come up with better numbers, which can be interpreted in a better way. So therefore, also just concluding on the things that I want to share with you, and knowing that this is a bit provocative, but I think it is important. I would say with a thing that energy system models today focus a lot on techno-economic solutions, and this is up to a certain extent also fine, because this is their primary need. They should show whether something is techno-economically possible. However, we have to be aware that media, politicians, and sometimes also modelers sometimes tend to overrate this techno-ecologic solution as something that is politically desirable and something that will definitely take place, and assuming that this is a kind of prediction or something, which it is not. It's not a forecast. And therefore, it is, I think, very important to improve the depiction of social, ecological, and political aspects even better in our models so that we can come up with these. It's not necessarily even second best, might be third best, fourth best, but it would be like a politically feasible, a socially feasible solution, which might come with additional costs. However, I wouldn't say it's additional costs, because I would say the other thing was never a viable solution. So therefore, it doesn't really make sense to use this as a benchmark in some kind of way. But basically, the only solution is like, let's look at all possible solutions which are politically, socially, and techno and economically viable. And then we can only look at those. And this is important to have this in mind. I think that the current depiction of these factors in models is still very limited, including my team, but also the teams of others. And we have to be aware of this. And the advantage is, of course, there's a lot of good research questions for PhD students, etc. So therefore, there's still work out there. We also have to be aware that, of course, some aspects will never be properly included in models. And I think this is okay. We will need some models which just only look at techno-economic aspects if it is feasible to run a dispatch or something like this. However, we also need other models, and we need to be able to differentiate. We need some kind of models that can switch on, switch off different aspects, because you, of course, always have to sometimes choose due to the computational power what you want to focus your investigation on. But we also have to be clear on which aspects are included within this model run and which aren't. And in some way, most models are not that explicit which aspects are not included, I think. So. Therefore, I would say one of the most important things is that the correct interpretation and framing of models is vital for the credibility of results and to justify the benefit of models. Because if we just use models to create some kind of numbers which are not really helping in showing realistic future pathways, then there is no benefit of the model itself. So therefore, the model is a helpful tool to provide specific insights given basically its setting. And therefore, it is clear to be clear on the setting itself, and to make it also clear for people that are not modelers, because for us it is relatively clear. We have an omniscient planner with a perfect foresight. However, reality, this is never the case. And so therefore, I think it is good to be a bit humble with respect to all the research that we have done still, and talk to one another, also talk to us, not only within the energy community, within the climate community that we are now trying with this conference, but also then to widen our scope to talk also more to social sciences and to see a bit in how far this can be helpful. I think it's also helpful, of course, to talk to stakeholders, the political decision makers, as well as people from other industries and NGOs, etc., to look for results that can be even more realistic and more helpful to ease this transition. So therefore, I would like to thank you very much for listening to me. I also want to thank especially the other people such as Alexandra Krumm and Konstantin Löffler that have also contributed to parts of the research that I was showing here, and looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pao Yu. It was very, very interesting presentation, especially, yeah, the last part, a very concrete reminder of what are the challenges and the limitations of our tools that we should constantly have in mind, and how, for instance, we can improve that. Waiting a bit for the questions, because until now we do not have anything. Just very, very brief question from my side. I mean, this integration of social aspects into models is very important. I think it's one of the core directions that our community should take for the futures. And all this, let's say, work, the groundwork that you have already done is vital in all this. So have you identified as part of this work any, for instance, lessons or any good practices that we should follow when we integrate these aspects into the more techno-economic modeling tools?
I think it's, I think one of the things is you have to be realistic in some kind of way. I think there's always also this challenge if you bring different communities together, and then you bring, for example, simplistically speaking, a social scientist back to the table, and he comes up with, well, this is how reality works. And the modeler looks at it as like, but this is too complex. I cannot include this at all. And then basically they just realize they don't speak the same language. And you basically need an interpreter in some kind of way who basically tries to explain which different elements are there, and in how far we sometimes have tools within the model that were not produced to replicate social aspects, but they can be used for that instances. So basically, I was speaking about this aspect that for example, the speed of the transformation is not sufficiently included in some of the aspects. And there is research with respect to social science, also by, for example, by Jessica Jewell, who looked at historic phase in and phase out of technologies, just basically plotting like what was the fastest historic transition of new technologies entering the market, and basically, and this is research, which is more not modeling research, which is done where we can easily say, okay, there's a certain maximum ramp up percentage for a technology within a certain region, which might be different for Germany compared to China, which might be different to any other country. So therefore, these are kind of numbers which you can then easily give to a model and say, basically, please include this maximum ramp up or this maximum ramp down constraints, so to speak, for technologies, which the modeler doesn't know. The modeler in general is then relatively flexible, whether he includes 10% or 15%, they don't really care. They just want to choose any of the number. And then, of course, it is important to look a bit and focus a bit on those things that have big impacts on the model. I think there's a lot of nice things which you could include, which make it more realistic, but they will not change the bigger picture, so to speak. However, in some cases, if we, for example, look at how realistic is the inclusion of these high volumes of hydrogen or something, then I think in this case, it might make sense to be a bit more critical and look at it. Okay, what are our assumptions here with respect to this ramp up? In which regions is it possible? We've seen this in the past in some cases with respect to hopes or hypes with respect to CCS technologies, where we then in the end didn't see any kind of uptake. So therefore, to be a bit more flexible or to have these kind of things. But let's see, the chat is still having lots of text. I'm just I leave it to you to read out what I should read. I don't know.
Yeah. Oh. Okay. First, okay. The Robert question was pretty large. I will read it afterwards. A question from Stefan. I've prepared because Stefan, also quite provocative, I must say. He says that there have been calls to better include these socio-political aspects into our models for a decade or more. So he asks whether there's any progress on that, or is it to some extent just an unachievable dream by the modelers?
Well, I would say that Stefan is among the people who's trying to work on this. So therefore, I wouldn't say that we have achieved this dream yet, because otherwise it would be amazing. But there's clearly, as I showed, I think people are starting to become aware of it. I think like 10 years ago, the modeling community was very closed, and now basically they've gotten quite some attention, however, also some critique. We've seen this also within the IPCC process. We've seen also that there's more competition among modeling teams due to open source software, due to open source models. So therefore, I think there is movement, and especially also there's a lot of young research teams which come up with progressive ideas. And so therefore, I think that there is hope, and I don't think it's an unachievable dream. I would say there is, I think, the dream of having the perfect model that can have everything, that doesn't make sense. Like, this is not a dream, and this is unrealistic, but this is something that maybe the political decision maker hopes for, like, give me one tool, but not 10. But this is not, of course, we need climate models, we need energy models, we need electricity models and stuff like this. We need aspects focusing on agent-based aspects, we need technical models, but at the same time, we need to be more specific which answers we can really answer with this kind of model and which things we cannot really answer, where we can just have some kind of things like, if we assume this from a perfect planner's perspective, this would be the best. Realistically speaking, in the European Union, we don't have a perfect planner, but still the Commission should, of course, think that way and kind of think, if we optimize things, this would be ideal, and then how to get to a more realistic scenario.
Thank you, Pao. Now the question by Robert, also quite important, I have to say, and where he basically challenges what you described a bit about the empirical, let's say, justification of the model. So, for instance, if we lived in the zeros, nobody ever predicted this very large scale up of PVs. And probably because this was unprecedented. So hundreds of scenarios failed to actually project to the future what we now observe as a reality. So he asks whether there is any, if we ensure this political transformation dynamics based on the current or past preferences, for instance, coal in Poland, as a hard limitation in the models, whether this will be like a lock-in, of our model-based results in the history. So, and actually reducing a bit the possibility of disruptive changes, which we sometimes see in the real world, like PV is a good example for that. So what is your reflection on this?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. And of course, sometimes there are changes. Like, for example, Panagiotis knows this better than I do also with respect to Greece. We would have never expected Greece to phase out coal that fast. And then suddenly they did it. And I think it's nothing that Panagiotis is to praise for, that it was his model results necessarily that said, okay, they can do it. Okay, we'll do it. But it's just political decisions that sometimes happen faster than anticipated. I think, nevertheless, that these models can be helpful by basically stating, for example, that in a status quo situation, this would be the most realistic scenario, which in some cases might turn out to then might reach climate targets, by basically saying, like, if we follow historic trends, we will not make it in time. So therefore, through this, you can then identify aspects where you say, okay, we need a faster closure of coal in this country in particular. We need a faster ramp up of this technology in this country, which is unprecedented in the history of that country. And then you are like, okay, so this is a problem. And of course, in the model, you can just fix the number and then it suddenly works. And you're like, now it's feasible, I'm happy. But then you need to think about the reality. Okay, if I need to phase down an energy carrier in a country twice as fast as it ever happened before, then I clearly need to work on this. And probably you don't need to come up with more technical solutions, but you probably need to work talking to politicians, explaining the solutions, increasing the acceptance, making more workshops, probably showcasing your scenarios by saying, like, believe us, there will be no shortages of electricity and stuff like this. And you need to maybe also have a backup plan just in case you don't manage to ramp up this aspect. So therefore, I think the model is then able to show you these things. I think this would be the high benefit. And of course, if we only stick to historic trends, then reality is we will never meet the climate targets, which is also an insight that we have to be aware that we have to become faster and faster. And this is, for countries such as Germany, a huge issue due to the bureaucratic system in place. And this is just, it's challenging.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Pao Yu. I mean, I love being also part of the discussion. Unfortunately, I cannot. One last question for you before we go to Francis, who is waiting for us. It's also a provocative question. I do not know why it's happened to you, but anyway, it's from Francesco Cardumi. And he asked that maybe if the models are always co-created and owned and understood by the final users, so in that case, maybe it's not always necessary to include social constraints in the sense that they are already incorporating the preferences of those that co-created the models. But if you have any insights.
Yeah, I think it depends always. Of course, like Stefan has showed that basically there is ways of co-creation with different stakeholders. However, at least within the teams that I've worked with, the majority of people that in the end really adjust the important parameters and do the mathematical formulation, they are modelers and they are interested in modeling, and they have, maybe they even are interested in social aspects, but they are no experts. And there is limited time. And of course, there are a few very talented people that are skilled interdisciplinarily. But however, if we want the best models to function, you need also really good coders that have done nothing else than just coding within the last years and are therefore that good at what they are doing. And there is also the need for these people. And so therefore, I think that co-creation is definitely a valuable thing. Nevertheless, I want to stress that I would never say that every modeler needs to be aware of all social aspects, that everyone needs to understand these things, but I just think that we need means for them to interact in some kind of way in all different stages of the different aspects. But it is important among modelers at least to achieve a kind of awareness of the necessity of qualitative research out there as well. And there is an awareness that we need also for the media, for journalists and for politicians, to not just believe every number that any kind of consultant will give them, because we know this, like you tell me which number you want and I can give you this number from my model in some kind of way if you just adjust the assumptions good enough. And so therefore we need to be a bit more humble, given also the fact that none of us created the numbers that we see now in reality. It's just how it is.
Thank you. Thanks, Pao Yu. I have to say I agree, but probably we should we take the discussion in the final Q&A. Thanks a lot. Very insightful presentation, but we have
Panagiotis, you're muted.
Sorry, I'm muted. Anyway, I was saying that we take this discussion to the final Q&A and we move to our fourth speaker, who is Francis Denning, who is a climate economist at the World Bank, where he models climate policy and climate impacts on the national level, using and modifying the World Bank's macroeconomic models. Before joining the World Bank, he was assistant professor of economics at Yale in Singapore, and he has made, of course, significant contributions to the integrated assessments modeling literature. And today, Francis will elaborate a bit on the large heterogeneity between the paths to net zero that we observe between developing and OECD countries. So, Francis, sorry for waiting. The room is yours.
No worries. Thank you, Panagiotis. Can everyone hear me? Or Panagiotis, can you just raise your hand if you can hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Perfect. Well, thanks for inviting me, and many thanks to the speakers that came before me. Some very interesting points, and I'll pick up on some of these as I go through my talk. If I have maybe two goals of my talk, it's on the one hand to ask this community to maybe turn their gaze a little bit, part of their gaze at least, towards the need to do better detailed modeling work in developing countries. In developing countries, there's a lot of interesting and challenging questions that are in many ways, in some ways similar to what most of you are working with in OECD countries, but there's also some very, very important differences. And there's now an increasing amount of demand also for this kind of work in these countries. A couple of things to note is that, I mean, now this is the first year where this is the European Climate and Energy Modeling Platform. To some extent, our session is about net zero, right? Net zero is not only about energy. And so to one extent, so we need to also start thinking a little bit about the other aspects of net zero that don't encompass energy. And this is particularly important in developing countries. And to second, also the last point of discussion that Payu raised, the need to capture the specific policy context and the social and behavioral drivers is just amplified in developing countries because the contexts are way more heterogeneous. We're talking about even amongst developing countries, there's so many different contexts, and the modeling community, in order to really speak to and support the transition to net zero also in developing countries, is going to have to take start thinking more about these issues. This is a graph that I mean, many of us have seen in various forms, is just to point out that the emissions, of course, and here I'm only capturing those from fossil fuels, the emissions from the developing world, which is pretty much this segment here that I'm picking up here, are already higher than in OECD countries. And so the need to start thinking about net zero in the developing world is obvious. I mean, and many of us, I'm exaggerating here, many of us, many on the call, I'm sure, have already been thinking about these things in the context of developing countries, but the thinking is well behind, and the demand for this kind of thinking is really only just growing. With the Climate Change Action Plan for the next 5 years, the World Bank has now proposed to produce a new analytical tool to help inform the client countries' development strategies in a manner that integrates both climate, which is sort of the focus of what we're talking about here, but also development, which is our main business, right? And the main points are to inform, prioritize, and sequence climate action, because as we said, the transition is a difficult matter in Germany. You can imagine how much more difficult it is in a country like Mozambique. This report that we'll be producing, or that we are producing, is supposed to support the preparation and implementation of all the NDCs that have been published and updated, and to also propose long-term net zero visions. Right? These are not sort of outcomes that we expect in particular will happen exactly that way, but it's about time to help a lot of these countries without the capacity to set out a vision of what could be possible to get to net zero, maybe not in 2050, but in 2060 or shortly thereafter. Anyway, these are just some details about this report that we're in the process of producing. Now, from the point of view of modeling, the main associated tasks are to derive costed scenarios for things like achieving the NDCs that they've already committed themselves to increase ambition in some credible way, I guess, and also to derive scenarios for net zero. These are significantly more ambitious scenarios in the developing country context. Now, in the last year, 20 to 25 of these reports have already been started and are already currently being completed. And over the next 4 years, we'll be completing over 150 of these reports. These are detailed, nationally specific reports on setting out scenarios for climate policy, the carbon transition, but also for dealing with climate impacts, which is not the topic of today, but a rather comprehensive report of the situation and the path of climate and development in these developing countries. And so the point that I want to make today is that this effort, the modeling effort needed, as well as the overall qualitative effort needed to write the report, will require very heterogeneous approaches. In these developing countries, all of them have very country-specific development objectives that are different from each other and different from the standard objectives that we find in Italy or Germany. A complicating factor is that there is little or poor data in a lot of these countries, and yet somehow we must still be able to provide them with some quantitative assistance. There is, and this speaks to the last point of discussion in Pauli's presentation, there is often very low policy implementation capacity, not always, but in some of these countries, very low implementation capacity. And the developing country economic structures are very different to what we're used to. And so the standard questions, the spotlights that we shine at certain parts of the problem are no longer the right ones. And that's sort of what I want to spend my remaining 10 minutes just highlighting. To maybe show some of you some interesting questions that you may not have thought of, some challenging challenges really for you to contribute to this, to this work in the developing world. So what we have here are the emissions profiles. This is a very standard Sankey diagram that many of you will know for an OECD country and a lower middle income country. And if you just look at it, from a bit far away here, you see the orange bit is on the left-hand side. We have the greenhouse gases in relative proportions of CO2 equivalent. And we have that the majority here is CO2. There's some methane, some fluorogases, and some nitrous. And on the right-hand side, we have the final economic sectors that are driving these emissions. In the middle here, we have everything that is energy and all the subcomponents of energy over here. And looking at it like this, you'd be hard pressed to say which one of these is the OECD country and which one of these is the lower middle income country. Now you look at, if I show you for the same two countries, the diagram for final energy consumption, already many of you who've thought a lot about this a little bit will probably already notice that the one on the right is probably the lower middle income country due to the large amount of coal in its energy consumption. And on the left hand, often we see that it's rather gas than coal. It's slightly cleaner fuel. And so it requires a different kind of approach to decarbonization. So the two countries I'm showing you guys here are Italy on the left and Vietnam on the right. Now, these are, of course, the two graphs here are not to scale, that these are very different total emissions, but the emissions profiles are what I want you to focus on. And so we have here a country like Vietnam, lower middle income. Many of you will not have thought too hard about what decarbonization entails in Vietnam, but it's, of course, an important question. Vietnam emits currently about 100 megatons of CO2 equivalent, of which 80 megatons are from emissions, are from energy use. And so the problem in Vietnam, actually, what I want to highlight with Vietnam here, is that the problem in Vietnam is actually very similar to many developed countries, where a lot of decarbonization is about energy use. Vietnam has very successfully electrified its population in the last 20 years. 99% of the population is electrified. Now, unfortunately, about 60% of that electrification has happened on the basis of coal power. The average coal power plant is 10 years old, but the privately owned ones are significantly younger. Half of the 95 megatons of coal that are burnt every year are imported. And the BAU modeling assumption, but also in their economic plan from 5 years ago, assumes a trebling of coal capacity. Now that's of course very, very far away from any kind of net zero ambition that the globe may have. Now, the country climate development report, this report that I said that the World Bank is now producing or going to produce for all developing countries, was just published for Vietnam, and so I can show you some of the results. The economic analysis is based on the managed CGE model, which is a pretty standard CGE model based on the GTAP input-output tables. And it's linked to an electricity planning model with plant level detail that does the least cost optimization. And that's where we get the energy scenario, so to speak. And amongst other things, what was done is that a net zero pathway was modeled. The pathway encompassed a rising carbon price, obviously putting downward pressure on demand, on energy demand in general, but also specifically on fossil fuel intensive energy, but also quantified additional investments over and above what happens when you choose a carbon price, and quantifies inside the macroeconomic model the costs of these investments, the opportunity costs of capital not going into other things, the changes to operational costs, and also the kind of macro structural changes that ensue. And so a little sort of summary of what this kind of net zero pathway looks like, and it'll be very familiar to many of you who've worked on this in developed countries. The pathway foresees about $80 billion in net present value in today's dollars of investment over the next 20 years. 80% of that is to go to the energy transition, and only 20% of that is split over transport, industry, and agriculture. But those investments on their own, without a carbon price, would lead to only a 21% reduction relative to BAU of emissions in 2040. So that's a large bill, and it targets the key components that can be, in some sense, targeted with public funds to drive the transition. Now, in addition to these 81 billion, the net zero scenario implements a carbon tax that starts at $90 per ton of carbon pretty soon, in 2030, and rises to $120 per ton of carbon in 2040. Now, the combined carbon tax and investment scenario, this is what they call the net zero scenario, results in a 73% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2040. Coal goes down to 35% of the electricity matrix, being 60% currently, with no CCS assumed in the modeling. The whole thing comes at a significant cost of 2.2% of GDP in 2040. So it's a little bit of a ramp up. And that's equivalent to 135 billion in net present value cumulative between now and then. So it's a significant cost. This net zero path is not something, of course, that comes for free in a country like Vietnam, and that shouldn't surprise you. But more than the overall cost, the losses are spread unevenly across sectors. Almost 300 billion are the losses to the energy industrial sectors alone, but these are offset to some extent by gains in other sectors. It leads, just to illustrate what can happen in these models, to 15% energy price increase in 2040. And the impacts are not homogeneous, of course. The most penalized households are likely younger, less educated, rural, and members of ethnic minorities. And so that, of course, leads to all sorts of social questions that one needs to ask in the implementation or even in the proposal of such a policy when you're the World Bank proposing this to one of your important client countries. So this is what was done in Vietnam, and really, in many ways, it's probably something quite familiar to the kind of work that you guys have done if you've already worked on net zero pathways. But let's look now at a completely different context. Here we have another lower middle income country, similar GDP per capita as Vietnam. That's Kenya here on the left. Kenya here on the left, and a least developed country, Mozambique, on the right. The energy demand now looks very, very different. right? Something like half or more, I think in Mozambique, I know the numbers more exactly, it's 2/3 of primary energy consumption are due to biomass. And in Kenya, clearly it's not very dissimilar. Now, if you look, so their energy consumptions look very, very similar. And so on the energy side of things, you think these two countries would face very similar problems when you're trying to model a net zero pathway. But if you look at the emissions profiles, they look very, very different indeed. You see here that in the case of Mozambique, half of it approximately is CO2. And if you count the equivalents from nitrous and methane emissions, land use change alone accounts for 2/3 of carbon emissions. Whereas in Kenya, land use change, at least according to the CAIT data that we use, doesn't account for any of the emissions. Most of the emissions are actually methane from agricultural use, but also going into energy use somehow. So just to say, these are countries where if you look at the energy profile, you think very, very similar problems, but in fact, the problems are very, very different indeed. And let me home in a little bit on Mozambique, just to sort of illustrate the kind of questions that we need to answer that we don't really, at least in this community and in the modeling community at large, have the right tools for yet, but that we need to start developing and need to start developing pretty quick if we're going to help countries like Mozambique, set the right path in the medium term for a net zero world in 30-40 years. Now, Mozambique emits about as much actually as Vietnam, 110 megatons of CO2 equivalent. But rather than 99% electrification, only 1/3 of the population has access to electricity. Electricity only accounts for less than 1% of emissions because most of electricity is hydropowered. Now, 75 tons of the 110 tons are due to land use change. And one report, really the only report we can get our hands on here, estimates that land use change is driven to 65% by small scale autonomous farming, effectively slash and burn, in order for small farmers to expand their agricultural land. 4% commercial farming. Now 15%, this is something that we can link back to energy. 15% of land use change is due to fuel, the biomass use, but not renewable biomass, in the sense that it's more biomass than the forest cover can renewably produce, and 16% is some other amount. Now, clearly in Mozambique, the big issues are very, very different from Vietnam or of course Germany. And any informative modeling that we need to do, and this is something that we've been working at for a year now. Unfortunately, the report is not out, so I can't show you any of the results. But just to say that we would have benefited significantly from improved modeling expertise on these issues that I'm highlighting here. Informative modeling will need to understand what are the incentives for small-scale farmers for driving land use change, and how will the behavior of these farmers evolve? What's the social context that might lead to less land use change? We need to estimate the transition to cleaner cooking methods. Now, this is something that's a big question in developing countries. Clean cooking, I mean, using biomass for cooking not only has a climate impact when it's not sustainably sourced, but it also has all sorts of health impacts that need to be improved upon. And all sorts of interventions and cheap cooking stoves have been proposed, and nothing really is pushing the needle on that. And so we need to figure out what can be done. More research needs to be done on that front, and then that knowledge needs to be integrated in our models. And then we need to look at what's going to happen to electrification. Only 1/3 of the country is electrified right now. If we just assume that energy growth is in step with GDP growth, which is what one might assume, we'd be effectively projecting a future that maybe eventually is net zero, but in which more than half the population is still not electrified, right? And so that's not really a future in which the local development outcomes that the important, social and political context is really being addressed, because first and foremost, rather than dealing with land use change and reducing carbon emissions, a country like Mozambique with a GDP per capita of $600 per year needs to electrify its population. And so these are questions that are very, very different from the modeling questions when you're looking at net zero that you've been asking yourselves. But they're challenging questions, they're important questions, and questions for which there is an increasing demand for. Again, we're going to be producing for almost every country in the world one of these reports, and in many of the countries that we're looking at, Mozambique, Kenya, Cameroon, have this particular feature about land use change being the main driver and biomass being a huge component of the energy matrix. And I guess what I want to end with is a modeling community to, spend some of your time and your expertise on trying to find answers to these questions. Yeah, I'll stop with that. And yeah, thank you for listening.
We have to thank you a lot, Francis, for this very insightful presentation, especially being able to improve our understanding of the heterogeneities in the different country contexts, especially the division between developing and OECD countries, different challenges that they face, the different specificities that they have, and in order to make our tools more useful for policy analysis in these different contexts. So thanks a lot for these insights. So starting on with the questions, because we have already some of them. The first one is from Will, who says that data availability in many African countries and Southeast Asian countries is a challenge. So what's the World Bank view on open data and capacity building around data in these countries?
So the World Bank's approach to economic data is that we are the de facto resource for macroeconomic data in developing countries. We're also a resource that aggregates all sorts of macroeconomic survey data, to the extent that this is based on either academic research or World Bank funded research, and that we can provide it, right? Energy data is a little bit more complicated. As you all know, energy data, to the extent that it exists in many of these places, I mean, the IEA, of course, tries to be comprehensive, but the quality of the IEA data is not always very good in these countries. And so I don't know if you've already worked in the context. Often you have to go and get proprietary data, and the World Bank, in fact, has to do exactly the same thing at this stage. Now, are you asking, would it be good to go out and find funding to establish a World Bank program to get open source energy data available? That probably is a good idea, but it's not the state of affairs right now. And so the World Bank itself actually struggles with getting detailed, high quality energy data, deforestation data, emissions data, all of that. And we're in some sense in a good position, because the institution faces the same problem across 160 different countries, and so sees where one can learn from what's happening in one country to another. But it's definitely not the case that the institution is now currently able to provide any kind of comprehensive open source database that spans all developing countries. But yes, that would be a highly important contribution, but also a very costly contribution, as you'll all know if you've had to deal with proprietary data.
Indeed. So thanks a lot for this, raising the important issue of data availability and also data quality, sometimes which is not great in these countries. So a very related question by Francesco, who said that, for instance, when you need to set up a model with very little data availability, of course, this implies huge assumptions that you have to make. And this, of course, creates some risks, because governments probably will not buy trust in that tool, or policy recommendations might be falsified a bit. So do you have, can you provide some examples and recommendations for us, the modelers, from the World Bank experience, of how you deal with that and how you can build trust in modeling tools, for instance, where you have to make huge assumptions about data that does not exist?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right that one has to make huge assumptions, and one important concern is the buy-in of the governments that we work with. I just want to add before I actually answer your question that there's another concern that is similar to what Paul you raised earlier, is that we're making huge assumptions, and then sometimes people believe some of these things too literally, right? And really, you know, when you're working in this space where you're making a lot of assumptions, what you're trying to do is you're trying to, you know, you generate storylines and illustrative scenarios, and we go to great lengths to explain that these are not forecasts over 50 years, right? And but it's important, it's a quantitative manifestation of a vision that might happen if certain things go on. And so the first thing you want to do, in fact, to stop people from over interpreting what you're doing, is to make clear that, especially in low information context, but I mean out to 2050, even in Germany, these things are scenarios, and we're not really often attaching any probabilities to these scenarios, and we're not having any expected forecasts either. Now, when it comes to other things, to get buy-in from the local, not just government, civil society, the private sector that's meant to drive investments, that needs some amount of certainty that the government will in fact implement a carbon tax in 10 years, because that matters to investments happening today, for example. So they're, of course, working at the World Bank. Well, you know, we have the luxury, a report like the one that I'm talking about here is done with a team of 30 people, of which 4 of them are economists sitting in the country office. In the case of Mozambique, they sit in Maputo, and they have regular meetings with the relevant ministries, with civil society, and there's some, I mean, often not as much as we would like to, but there's some amount of feedback going on there, right? There's a continuous engagement. The last report that was written for Mozambique on macroeconomics regarding debt issues, not climate, was only published last year. That required a lot of engagement. And so we're an institution that is in continual engagement with these client countries. And so when we produce a new kind of report on climate, we have the open channels, on the one hand, to, you know, to make the proposals that we're making in these reports, but on the other hand, to bring on board concerns, questions, and an understanding of the local policy context that that stems from, you know, the wide network of country offices and local engagement that we have. How, as an academic researcher, you know, to be able to bring on board, I mean, knowing the country, when you're doing national studies, knowing the country contexts, you know, whether you work at the World Bank and you have a country economist telling you, or because, you know, you're working with some kind of NGO that knows it well, or this country was the, you know, your focus during your PhD and you just know a lot. Country knowledge is super important, and with the country knowledge also, you know, comes sensitivities to the relevant policy considerations, right? That being said, you know, yeah, even so, even at the World Bank, one has to be somewhat careful of how far one wants to push certain ideas, how far one wants to also take what the government's priorities on board, because also governments, you know, governments change all the time, and there's that sort of dynamic that you have to incorporate. Governments swing from being, just in Kenya now, a new president was sworn in who has a relatively ambitious climate plan. Now, that was not the case necessarily with the previous government, right? So I think your question is just the right question. There isn't a single answer, of course, especially if you're working as an academic researcher. But of course, there's the scope to contribute via things like what the World Bank is doing, but also all sorts of other organizations. I mean, all the other multilateral development banks do this kind of work. Increasingly, this has been, of course, finally, these institutions have realized the importance of this, and so there's just a lot of scope to work with these institutions as well, if that's what you're interested in.
Thanks a lot. Of course, there's no single answer, but you provide many interesting insights. I mean, especially on the importance of these local meetings and interactions with stakeholders and NGOs, civil society organizations, etc., on the local level. It's quite important, I think, for all of us doing our job. Also, another question by Gorkem Gungor. So she says that it's difficult to address climate change, which is a global phenomenon, and to address that in national reports. How do you address the synergies and trade-offs between the different countries when it comes to climate change, of course, because one country cannot solve the issue alone. So how you address this aspect in your analysis?
So, I mean, the short answer is we don't focus on that, right? This is a country climate and development report. It's not about addressing climate change, right? It's, I mean, it's about mapping out a path for individual countries in which they make their contribution to mitigation, but also the necessary investments to adapt to whatever climate futures might expect them. But it is, you know, it's also at the same time a development report and about how one can integrate a ambitious mitigation scenario over and above what the NDCs say with their development agenda. That's not to say that in the analysis we ignore completely what's happening in the rest of the world. I mean, of course, we need to incorporate scenarios, for example, simply for climate change. We don't just talk about mitigation, but also about the impacts and adaptation. And so in this kind of national analysis, you have to ask yourself, well, what is the climate future? What kind of RCP do we expect? And what would that mean for the costs on society? But also, we incorporate in often very simple terms various different global decarbonization scenarios, right? And to the extent that this matters when you're a country like, let's say, Angola or Mozambique, a scenario I'm just bringing an example here, a scenario in which there's a lot of decarbonization, the OECD demand for fossil fuels goes down to very, very little by 2030 or 2035. Now, if you're an oil exporting country like Angola, well, that's important for your development. And you know, these are questions that we look at. So we look at what the global environment, especially regarding climate and decarbonization, is doing. We think of alternative scenarios and we see how those scenarios affect what what is possible in the national context. But the modeling that we do is not about, this is not integrated global assessment, right? There are things like, you know, how is decarbonization going to affect demand for your exports, for example? How is a potentially more ambitious carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU going to affect the exports of Morocco if they decarbonize? How does it affect their exports if they don't decarbonize? We do include those things, but it's very much through specific channels that affect the national context. We don't, you know, this is very much about, this isn't about, these reports are not about addressing climate change as a global phenomenon. It's about providing these developing countries the tools to think about how climate is going to affect them and about how they can make their contribution to decarbonization, in part in self-interest, but also in part because it's necessary. We've seen what the emissions are, and if they don't do it, all the decarbonization, the most ambitious scenarios in the OECD are not going to get us anywhere.
Thanks a lot for this comprehensive reply. I think we are covered. We don't have any more questions for you. Thanks a lot, Francis, for bringing this perspective from the developing world. Thanks a lot. And now going to the last, but not least, of course, presenter. Here with us is Paul Dean, who is a senior research fellow in clean energy futures in the Environmental Research Institutes in the University College of Cork. He has extensively co-authored over 150 papers in the future of energy, dealing with issues like electricity markets, renewable energy integration, global and European power systems, etc. And Paul will talk about the challenges for the modeling community in delivering a net zero energy system. So, Paul, the floor is yours. We cannot hear you, Paul. Okay. So, okay, while waiting for Paul probably to rejoin, I have also a question for you, Francis, if you are still here with us, just to fill the time gap. Good. Yeah, you mentioned this distributional impacts of mitigation pathways is also quite important issue also from our research. And you showed, for instance, that when you implement ambitious carbon tax, then the most vulnerable households, the poorer, the younger, the small farmers, etc., face the highest challenges. So I was wondering whether you have examined also the impacts of different ways to redistribute, to recycling these carbon revenues. For instance, if there is targeted support to the most vulnerable households, whether this will change the distributional impacts and can achieve, for instance, more equitable pathways for these countries.
So yeah, I mean, in short, yes, we have. Of course, poverty reduction and distributional issues are one of the more important things that we do at the World Bank. So on the one hand, we're in a good position to model this kind of stuff because we do have access to a lot of microeconomic survey data and the in-house capacity to deal with that. In terms of what policies we choose to analyze for redistribution, there is, the blanket equal per capita return is in some sense the easy thing to do, and almost in all our analyses we do one of these, but it certainly is a very expensive one because you end up also subsidizing a lot of people that don't need it, right? Now, anything that starts getting more complex than that requires fiscal capacity that is very, very difficult, right? If you think of doing something like a equal per capita dividend of a carbon tax in a European country, you'd probably think of doing it through the tax system. People would get an offsetting sort of a bonus on their tax bill. In a country like Peru, where we were working on last year, 70% of the labor force is informal and simply doesn't pay taxes. And so and those are also probably the ones that you'd need to support once the energy bills go up. And so this is where redistributive, the best intention redistributive policy comes up against the local kind of a capacity context. So it's very difficult. But yes, we've analyzed in the Peru context. I was just presenting something yesterday where we focused on redistributing some component of the carbon tax revenues, once you implement carbon tax, on the 3 lower quintiles. And that's of course much more effective because you're not giving any money to the top 2 quintiles. It's cheaper to help the poor, and in general, something more targeted to the extent that it's possible is probably preferable.
Good, thanks a lot, Francis. Quite important issue as well. Now, Paul, have you?
Can you hear me now, Peniokos?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, let me jump. Sorry, apologies, everyone. Ironically, when I went in to tune in this morning, my internet wasn't working, and it's actually because we're installing smart meters here in Ireland, and the smart meters are wonderful, but the smart people who install them don't tell you that they're cutting off your power for 30 minutes while they do it. So I am the proud owner, as of 1 hour and 30 minutes ago, of a new smart meter. I now just need to figure out how to use it. So so look, my presentation is relatively brief, and I'll make up for the last time. And thank you all. I've really enjoyed the sessions yesterday and today. Very challenging and enjoyable. Challenging in terms of getting different ways to think about our community as modelers, different ways to think about, I suppose, our role and our responsibilities in the profession that we do. So thank you all very much for joining in. And I appreciate I stand between us and lunch, so I will keep this relatively brief. Many of the points actually I want to make have been made by the previous speakers, and we heard some of in some of the conversations that we had as well yesterday. My talk isn't a technical talk. It's essentially, I suppose, a reflection of some of the frustrations I have in terms of what we can do as a community in terms of delivering climate action. Obviously, everybody listening online, we're all very passionate about what we do. We all believe in what we do. But if you look at the situation in terms of climate action in Europe, in our own countries right across the world, as a society, as a nation, we're not really delivering on it. One of the things that we do in our university, we spend a lot of time working with models. Ireland we're relatively fortunate. It's a small country, so we have good interaction with policymakers. We spend a lot of time working with government over the last number of years, with civil society, with different stakeholders. And a couple of things come true in all those conversations. We march in there with our models and say, look, we've got least cost optimal scenarios to net zero. We've got lots of scenarios. But that doesn't get people excited. And there's a fundamental, I suppose, acceptance from a policy perspective and also from a social perspective look, they tell us that we know why we have to act. We understand the science of climate change. So we get that. We know what we have to do. So policymakers will often say to us, look, we know we have to reduce emissions. We know we've got to sell more EVs. We know we've got to get more public transport. We know we've got to get dietary changes. We know we've got to get more renewables. But how can we deliver that? And that how do we deliver those results that we see in our models into the real world is something I'm struggling with, something that we're trying to get better at here within the university. For the last couple of years, it's really, I suppose, changed our thinking from the what and the why within our models to how we can actually take those results on paper and translate them to people and hopefully deliver some action. And I suppose the question I'd like to pose, or the question I guess I'm struggling with is, and I'm being deliberately provocative here a little bit, is do we need better models or do we need better modelers? And I suppose we probably need both, but I think there is a challenge for our community, and we've heard this as well from other speakers, just to put ourselves out there into other elements of the social of social society. It's not just about telling people what the answers are, it's listening to what needs to be done and then understanding how do we actually deliver that. And better mathematical models doesn't always translate into better actionable items. And that's where maybe better modelers can come in, and better communication and better listening with our models as well, fundamentally. One of the things we've noticed over the last number of years, this is just a Sankey diagram of my own country's energy system. Many of you might have come across this in your own interactions with policy or with public or different civil actors in civil society, but climate literacy and energy literacy within the public domain is relatively low. Even within the political domain in my country, it's relatively low. People understand the need for renewables, and they connect, I suppose, a lot of the good news around solar and wind and EVs with an expectation that we're actually doing pretty well. Lots of people are surprised to hear my own country, Ireland, is one of the most fossil fuel dependent countries in Europe. We sell this image of being green and clean. We've done really good things in terms of the integration of variable renewables into our power system, but we still have the maybe 16th or 17th cleanest power system in the EU, and we are still just under 90% reliant on fossil fuels. So whatever about our community thinks about the future, I think it's very important to present a real matter-of-fact perspective of where we are in the present. And part of this confusion, I guess, comes with the over, I suppose, emphasis of the power sector within the energy sector. So we use these things like Sankey diagrams. Look, and I appreciate that not everybody gets these things. These show energy flows from different fuels right across society, with supply on the left-hand side, demand on the right-hand side, and any transformations. We find these are very useful for, again, for civil society to understand our starting point. And that's really important, because if you think we're doing really well with renewables, and look, some countries are doing amazing things out there in terms of reducing their emissions and deployment of renewables, but some countries aren't. And look, I raise my hand from my own country for that. But if you think you're doing well, the incentive to do more is less. So for us as a modeling community, I think trying to promote climate literacy, trying to promote energy literacy at a political level and at a societal level is really important. And talking about our roles of all energy and all emissions, not just emissions that are in the power sector, is fundamentally important, because it manages and helps, I suppose, control the expectation of what's required ahead. And that's fundamentally very important. So that's my first point, I suppose, really, in trying to understand, in translating our mathematical results into real world models. Is not so much about concentrating on the future, but explaining where we are in the present. And look, regrettably, the energy crisis has brought that into stark focus, hasn't it? And for many European householders and many European policymakers, that we're finally understanding the reliance of electricity, the reliance of energy and fossil fuels that we have in Ireland and right across Europe. We also do, like many of the talks that we have here. I'm not going to go into the results for Ireland in particular, but we look at net zero strategies. We tend to look at, in Ireland, our climate policy is based around cumulative emissions rather than at emissions in some snapshot in time like 2050. Cumulative emissions, of course, are a better way to capture the climate science. It's the cumulative emissions of CO2 and associated greenhouse gases that are doing damage within our atmosphere. But often when we talk about the future, and we show these lovely slanky diagrams, and Outlook, we model hundreds of different types of futures that you can use to stay within our carbon budgets. But they're confusing, and it's difficult again for policymakers and the wider society to understand. So what we try and do is, when we run lots of different scenarios, we try and carve out the solutions that are resilient, that are robust, that are common. And we tend to frame these as no regrets or low regrets options. And I know many of you do this already, but we find it's very helpful because it allows us to carve out the elements of the conversation that are kind of settled by the science, and then allows us then maybe to park the parts of the conversation that are evolving in terms of, let's say, the role of negative emissions, the role of hydrogen in certain areas. Those things are important, but often they can be a distraction for the near-term options, near-term actions that we need to do. And in my own country, what tends to happen when we talk about hydrogen and we talk about renewables, at a political level, we get swept up in a wave of long-term optimism that blinds us to the near-term problems around security of supply, around our reliance on fossil fuels, around grid infrastructure, around transport, and around agriculture. So we try and control the conversation a little bit, or else decompose the conversation into near-term actions that have low regrets or no regrets. And from a policy perspective, this is helpful, because in many ways it can allow political agreement across a broad element of political parties and allow those things to be agreed on. And when political parties agree on things right across the spectrum, that is key, hopefully, for adding or injecting a little bit of agility and a little bit of urgency into the system. So in the results for Ireland, and look, these aren't always going to be the same for your country. We find that the policy levers that are resilient and robust or common are energy efficiency, electrification, and deployment of market-ready renewables. And that allows us, from a political and societal perspective, to kind of almost stop arguing on those things and hopefully focus and deliver on it. We try and present, I suppose, the steps, the incremental or the chronological steps in terms of these flow diagrams. And again, this is kind of looking at the results that we have in terms of mathematical numbers, looking at all the energy service demands, and looking at all the terawatt hours that we have in our models, and translating those into real world actions. The first and foremost that we find is very important is just to get policymakers and society just to think with a net zero mindset. Think about no pollution, and every decision really that should be embedded in the core decision making of any element of society, whether it's building new road infrastructure, new rail infrastructure, new airport infrastructure. You must think with that long-term vision, and that's a helpful thing that we find in terms of getting that message into the policy space. The other thing that's fundamentally important is it's not just about the wind resource or the solar resource. It's about the resource or the environmental investment landscape in your country. So stable policy is fundamentally important, and that links to these no regret options. And from a business perspective, the thing that they crave most is probably certainty. There's a lot of companies willing to invest huge amounts in the supply of renewables, in EVs, in different infrastructure. But the thing that they need is stability, and they need certainty around those investment decisions. And that's where it's helpful if you can carve out in your model those resilient choices that are suitable for your country. That's very helpful because it allows to de-risk some of those things. And that's something we find very useful. And then we tend to try and carve out the certain elements of the conversations that are a bit more controversial, but a bit more long-term as well, if we're being honest. The role of hydrogen in certain elements, the role, how much negative emissions or how many negative emissions would you need, carbon capture and storage. So we tend to frame these as future choices, our future energy choices that need to be understood, that need to be investigated, but can't become a distraction to the action today. So we try and cut our model up in different ways. When we're speaking to civil society, or speaking to farmers, or speaking to people who sell oil or coal for a living, or petrol stations or diesel stations, we tend to try different narratives to kind of get our model results into their ways of thinking. So at the moment in Ireland and looking right across Europe, we tend to have three overlapping crises. We have an energy crisis, which at its core is a fossil fuel crisis. We have a climate crisis, and we have a cost of living crisis. So depending on who we're talking to in the civil domain, we will either frame our narrative around one of these headings, be it the climate crisis, if we're, for example, speaking to NGOs around environment, maybe fossil fuels for speaking to political, and cost of living if we're speaking to maybe charitable organizations. But fundamentally, while it doesn't change what you need to do, and this is one of the things, these crises tend to overlap, and many of the solutions tend to be the same. You know, if you have a fossil fuel crisis, emergency crisis, moving away from fossil fuels and exploiting low cost or market ready renewables is a really good idea. So often when we're thinking about our results, we think about who we're speaking to, and we'll often frame those results around different narratives. It doesn't change what you need to do, it changes how you talk about it. And for us, we found that very useful. There's a huge social interest in my country at the moment in moving away from fossil fuels, and that's really good. If we were to frame that argument around reducing emissions, it's difficult to get traction with wider elements of society, even though fundamentally you're doing the right things. And then we try and disperse those or distill the action items from our modeling results into priority actions. And often we try and distinguish between enabling actions, that are enablers, and actions. There are certain things you need to do first of all before you can act on things. And I'll talk a little bit about how we explain that at the moment. For us in Ireland, and look, we saw this replicated in Repower EU as well to a certain extent. When we kind of look at our results, and if we're being honest and saying, well, how can we get this amount of renewables on the grid, or how can we get this level of public transport? For us in Ireland, a huge challenge is our planning system. We have a planning system that moves at a pace that's not at with a lack of agility that's at odds with the crises that we're going at the moment. And then there's other elements that are really more country specific. But the other thing that comes through in our analysis as well, and probably you or so as well, is that early action is really a key. Of all the options available to governments in terms of deployment of renewables or moving away from fossil fuels, waiting isn't one of them. And that's where it's helpful sometimes to carve that conversation out between things that are robust and certain within your model, and then that allows us then as modelers to talk about all the wonderful things around stochastics and all this least regret options. But those longer term options in terms of hydrogen, in terms of negative emissions, they shouldn't be a distraction to early action, and action is key. And with our models, if we can put a cost on action. The other things that we tried to do recently, and this is about those enablers to action. So again, the policymakers will say, look, we know we've got to sell air source heat pumps, but why aren't we doing it? We know we've got to sell electric cars. Why aren't we doing it? So then we think about, well, what are the enablers of those actions? And that has allowed us to interact with different levels of I suppose, of researchers within academia. So this is the building sector, for example. So it gets us to think a lot more about building regulations, to interact with spatial planners, with architects, with social planners. And a lot of the stuff that we see is actually, it's levels of bureaucracy or levels of deficiencies in administration that are real roadblocks to a lot of the things that we need to do. So a common theme that's come through a lot of our analysis in Ireland is that, look, we need a properly resourced planning system. Wind farms and solar farms and all these things have a huge planning burden. These reports are thousands of pages long. And fundamentally, we don't have enough people in our planning system to read those reports and to make good decisions quickly on those. So a lot of it actually comes down to people. It allows us to interact with trade unions. It allows us to interact with apprenticeship associations. So again, the challenge around air source heat pumps in Ireland, in my country, is not so much about the cost. A lot of people understand the long-term benefits in terms of reducing your costs, but there's a real lack of people to supply them. There's a lack of certification. There's a lack of training. So thinking about these things and bringing our model results back to a root cause and thinking about enablers to allow the actions that realize within the model. And fundamentally, another element that we find very important when we're communicating our results is to talk about emissions. Climate action is fundamentally about reducing emissions. It's not about deploying as much renewables as you can, as quickly as you can. It's really about deploying as little renewables as you can in as quick as time as you can. So getting people to think about, particularly at a policy level, not so much as at a social level, because it's not so important, but at a political level, thinking about emissions. In Ireland and in this part of Northwest Europe, we tend to get caught up in renewable energy targets, renewable electricity targets, but of course those targets change as the denominator under the line in terms of final energy consumption or final electricity consumption changes. So thinking about emissions is a good way to keep people honest and to keep an eye on those things. So we make these cheat sheets for policymakers, for people in local administration, for people in local councils. And look, while they're not a panacea, they allow people to kind of cut through the density of our results sometimes, and they have a one-pager and they can see about what's important, what needs to be done, what are those key enablers that will allow those actions to be developed and allows, I suppose, people to get to the root cause of the problem. The same thing, we do these for, we do these for power sector, for agriculture, for land use, for industry. This is our one for the power sector. And again, it comes back to a common thread about planning. It's the big challenges in my part of the world is not that we have a lack of technologies. It's not that we have a lack of ideas. It's not that we have a lack of wind. We're an incredibly windy place, just looking out the window here this morning. It's that we have a planning system and a bureaucracy that's associated with that, that's at odds with the urgency and the emergency around the energy crisis and the planning crisis that we have at the moment. And when we scratch that a little bit more, we see it comes down to people. Again, we have a poorly resourced planning, and we have a heavily resourced, I suppose, industry that's trying to push things through planning. So a lot of it comes back to people. And that has been a difficult thing, it's because this is new territory for us. It means we've got to interact with planners, with urban planners, rural planners, learn about planning guidelines. And it's been a real lesson in listening. The days, I think, of us as a modeling community and going out and telling people what the results are gone. I think people know what we need to do. It's really up to us as a community to listen and to see how can we best use our modeling in different ways to answer some of those questions. One of my colleagues in Ireland here is a really interesting piece on planning at the moment. And she used that by tying into integrated assessment models and by manually or by hardwiring some delays into those models. And she was able to put a cost on the cost of delayed planning versus the cost of correctly resourcing a planning department. And she found actually the cost of delay is much, much greater. That's a really clever way of using our models. It's something that I wouldn't have thought of a number of years ago. It allows us as modelers, I suppose, to be a bit more relevant in a policy space that's crying out for ideas, particularly around action. So we find these sheets relatively useful and relatively helpful. But I suppose to finish off, I suppose that was really just, I suppose, reflections on what we're doing. It's real, and I suppose laying down the challenge for us as a community to kind of not move away because it's not suitable for everybody, and Paul, I think you said it in one of the previous talks. This isn't for everybody, but somebody needs to do it. If we are insular and isolated as a modeling community, our results will never get out there. And look, we're not, and thankfully a lot of us are very proactive. Many of us are very proactive, and that's welcoming. But I think the challenge for us really is to get out there and listen. And again, just to acknowledge that at a policy and a social perspective, people understand why we have to act, they understand what we have to do, and how can we as a modeling community best communicate and explain how we deliver the results in our modelers, in our models. And I suppose the question that I posed to you at the start, let me rephrase it again. Do we need better models or better modelers? In my mind, we probably need both. And I think it's time for this community, and we are already moving towards the better modelers element of this question. And I think that's a good thing for society, and hopefully it would lead to those emissions reductions and those moves away from fossil fuels that we so desperately need in Europe and right across the world at the moment. So Panayiotis, I will hand it back to you, and thank you very much for tolerating my incompetence in connecting with volume to you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Very, very interesting insights and quite useful presentation. Also, looking back at the basics. I mean, the very basic question, if we need better models or better modelers. So thanks a lot. So I have to say we only have 3 minutes. Probably we can take 2 or 3 more, but if there's any question, please raise it now to Paul, because we should be fair. He was the last speaker. So if anyone wants to raise any question, Paul, please do it.
I think we're all getting hungry at this stage now.
Yeah, this is the tricky part, but I should be fair with you. So this is why I'm letting some time now for people to be active or probably. Okay, so thanks a lot, Paul. And if anything comes when I have. Let me check the chat. Okay, it's a comment mostly from Francesco, not a question, but yeah, it makes you think. Yeah, it's exactly this this idea of yeah. of your presentation, I think, Paul, and this is why we invited you here. So thanks.
Thank you so
a
much.
lot.
Thank you.
So it's now we are moving towards the end of all this, but of course, Lance is waiting. But please, the final statement is only a few words for me, not about what we've heard today. We need some time to really digest that, but mostly about what happens next, because the day does not end now for ECMP. We have 4 parallel sessions. They are 2, focusing on important issues for the transition to net zero. Some of them we touched also in the plenary. These include consumer behavior, just transition, the role of hydrogen, and also innovation and competitiveness. So we have 4 parallel sessions. And after that, the day closes with a poster session at 4, where about 25 posters will be presented there. And tomorrow, actually, the day starts with the skills workshops, 3 skills workshop running at 9 p.m. So if anyone's interested, please register through B2Match platform, because it's important for our skill workshop presenters to know how many people they expect. So having said that, I would like to thank you, all of you, especially the 5 speakers. I mean, Paul, Francis, Pauliu, Stefan, and Alban, for the very, very interesting insights. And also all the participants for the very active participation and the very good questions that they posed. So it was a pleasure for me, and I hope you have a good lunch, and see you next in the afternoon session of ECMP.
Thanks for moderating and for keeping the time.
Thanks, Benedict. Thanks, everyone.